Good morning. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. We are going to start in a couple of seconds. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes just to let everyone get connected and settled in. So grab your coffee, grab your tea, get comfortable. And as you are settling in, maybe, drop us a little note as to where you're connecting from. We love to see where everyone is based. I am based in Paris. I think, Catherine, you're based in London, correct?
Yes, correct.
We've got a worldwide team. Glenn, you are based in London as well?
No, we're based in Brussels. I'm sitting in the
You-
room with Vince, so we're both in
Amazing.
Brussels.
Okay, I love it. Three different countries. So yeah, don't hesitate to let us know where you're connecting from. Starting to get a couple of people joining. So we're just going to give it just a couple more seconds and then we will get started. Very sunny and hot where we are. I'm sure it's the same for you, Glenn and Catherine.
We're in
Yes.
the middle of a heat wave, so
Yeah. Middle of the heat wave in the month of May, which is pretty rare. Okay, I'm starting to see a couple of people connecting. Let's kick it off for introductions. So, welcome to all those that just joined. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. We have a really interesting topic that we're going to cover today: Amplitude and Human37, navigating complex migrations for success. I am here with Catherine, who is our Senior Engagement Manager at Amplitude, as well as Vincent, co-founder and technical lead at Human37, and Glenn, co-founder of Human37. Thank you so much for being with us today. Before I actually hand it over, just to let everyone know, this is an interactive session, so please don't hesitate to ask any questions, either using the chat or the Q&A. We'll make sure to take time to answer those questions and get to them. Also know that this session is being recorded, so we will share the recording with you after the event. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Glenn to get us started.
good morning, everybody. We have a couple of topics today. First of all, we have the migration best practices that we'll run through on my end. Then we have Catherine going through the migration plan, and then we have Vince showing you the technical migration path using Sherpa. I have a couple of IDs to share with you. So I'm Glenn, as I was introduced, co-founder at Human37. I'm the analytics lead, and I've been working with the professional services of Amplitude for the last 4 to 5 years. As a result, we have quite some experience on migrating customers into Amplitude, and I want to share some key highlights or key takeaways or to-dos or whatever you want to call it. Keep it in the back of your head when you're migrating, best practices that I want to share with you today. The total is, I believe, 14 IDs that we want to share, bite-sized for you to take away so you are prepped when it comes to migrations. First element, I'm going to rearrange my screen a tiny bit. Voila. First of all of these shares or these best practices, I'll categorize them in 4 categories. The first three are fairly obvious. What are the things you need to be aware of before your migration? So you make sure you are set up for success. What are the elements during migration? But also what are the elements after go live? What do you need to take care of as soon as you are going live? There's a separate category, which I call governance. I'm kind of a governance and documentation nerd. So there's a couple of IDs I could not resist to share with you, and they deserve their separate category in this entire flow. So let's get started. Before you start, number one is log the why. I believe this is a very important element. It's so obvious, but it's also very much overlooked, right? What we see a lot for organizations is that they are migrating for the sake, in a lot of cases, of migrating. And we want to prevent people from falling into that trap, right? The idea of a migration is that you need to lock in into the why. The question you need to ask yourself is, which is basically a typical analytics question, is like, what am I trying to achieve with my data and what is preventing me from achieving that today, right? If the answer to that question is today I have a limitation in my platform, then migration is typically a very good idea to migrate towards a platform that will enhance the capabilities or capacities of your team to get insights from that data, right? If you are more convinced about the future or the vision of a specific product, that also makes a lot of sense. The reason why I put this front and center to start with is simply because a lot of organizations forget this, and it's also very hard at that point to evaluate if your migration was actually successful and if the intention was actually achieved. So locking in on the why is a number one element to define before your migration and before you set out on the track. Next, run a full asset inventory. What is an asset? An asset is something that we call a digital surface, a product, anything that you would track. Think of applications, mobile, iOS, Android. Think of websites. Think of anything else where data is being captured and sent to your analytics platform, right? This also sounds very obvious. However, we have run mass scale migrations where every other week a new surface or a new asset would surface saying like, hey, we also would like to be part of this Amplitude project. And because of the inventory was not made up properly or indexed properly, that creates a bit of complication and a bit of frustration, right? You'll also be surprised of how many assets you actually have, forgotten assets, old assets, subdomain, cross-domain stuff that's happening. This one marketing domain that you had but you've forgotten about. And it's also a good moment to clean up stuff, right? Think of a migration as the opportunity to also do some sort of a spring clean and understand what do we have in our closet and what do we want to migrate to the new platform and how do we migrate that, taking into account the purpose of each element. Next, we have indexing all events, right? When people think about migrations, we typically think about moving tracking from platform A to platform B. It's not only moving tracking, it's also the opportunity, like I said, to do some sort of a spring clean. In order to do a spring cleaning, you need to understand what are the events that I'm actually tracking, right? It's also the opportunity to look into, are my naming conventions properly set? Do I have discrepancies across all of my products and my assets? But it also is the moment where we can say, hey, actually these two events, they should become one event, right? So it's a moment to index literally all of your events and evaluate what do you want to take with you and what should be reworked. It also sets you up for the next step, which is essentially locking in your metrics. I've been analytics for over 10 years. And the number one problem that we see, or where we go from, we want to do something with our data, but actually end up in debating what is the metric or what is the right number, is because people aren't aligned with the metrics, right? So if we have an index of all our events, we understand what is the metric or the unit of measurement that we have. And then we need to align on the metrics. A very simple idea is if you move from, let's say, a simpler platform into Amplitude, Amplitude offers you the possibility in funnels to set your time ranges. As a result, the metric that you get for conversion rate is impacted by that. So aligning on what is the conversion rate across teams and having that uniform definition of what we mean when we say conversion rate actually helps you during your migration and also prevents a lot of problems afterwards, right? Amplitude offers the idea of a shared metric library where you can have a verified metric. And this is something you actually want to look into before your migration. Today we have reports, let's say in platform A, we define conversion rate as a specific formula. We want to move it to Amplitude. It's important that everybody's aligned so they can immediately start using that metric going forward. Just like indexing all of your events, the result is as well that I would urge everybody to take stock of how many dashboards do you have. Again, there might be way more dashboards than you think you have and then you actually need. And this is also the moment to understand which ones do we need to migrate, because if we need to migrate a specific widget or a chart within a dashboard, it also means we understand which metrics do we need to ensure business continuity and which events we need to track in order to make them up. Define your historical data you need and how much. When we ask the question, how much historical data do you want to take with you during a migration? The typical answer we get is all of it. Understand that bringing data also comes with a cost. And the idea is always like bring as much data as you need, not as much data as you potentially can, right? It's also a principle in data minimization. But here the question is like for business continuity, again, analytics serves the business. So from a business point of view, how much data backlog do we need in order to ensure our business continuity? Vince will go into the migration part itself a bit later when we showcase the operational parts and the technical bits of Sherpa. So this is everything you need to do before you start. If we move into the next category of key takeaways or notes to take with you when you migrate, during the migration, build a baseline and track in parallel. What does that mean? Typically, it means when you're doing a migration, you are already on a analytics platform. and you have decided to lock in on the why, you validated the why that it makes sense to a new platform, and you've set out your migration journey. You've set out all of the elements, the checks that we've just done before migration, and now we're entering the during migration phase. It doesn't mean that on, let's say, the 1st of June, you migrate, that we're turning off platform A on the 30th of May, and that we, or 31st of May, sorry, and that we open up the new platform on June 1st. The best practice is actually for a specific period, let's say 30, 60, or 90 days, to actually track in parallel. Why is that? To get aligned and to get used to the new platform, as well as having something to fall back on and building your trust, right? What typically happens is that there's a very, very small variation in metrics or numbers between two platforms. It means that your 5 in platform A now becomes 5.1 in platform B. It doesn't mean that something is wrong. It means that the type of measurement or the technical way that things are measured might differ a tiny bit, but it means that you don't have to panic whenever you see 5.1. It means that your 5.1 is actually your new baseline. Right? And this is what we mean by building a baseline and tracking in parallel. Never turn one off and immediately move into the next, but actually keep parity for a specific period, depending on the type of business you're in, of course, to ensure that you get used to the new number that is your new norm. Build access processes from day one. This is one of the elements that we've seen at mass scale migrations, typically in very large companies, that is super important. We have organizations, or we have migrated organizations where we have 200 plus users with different access rights, different projects, etc. So it's important. I'm a process guy. It's a bit boring, but I kind of enjoy it because I like to structure my stuff and I like to make things predictable. I think also it makes business work very well. But building processes, access processes from day one, I believe, is super important. It means that we have in Amplitude, for that specific client, we have a number of groups. We have role-based access controls, and it means that depending on the job you need to do, you automatically get assigned to a specific access group with a specific role, right? It makes things very predictable. It also means that whenever you do migrations at a larger scale and your implementation is a bit bigger with multiple projects, multiple users, that we can ensure consistency, that only a specific amount of people get admin rights, that specific people get manager, that specific people get members, right? So it's very important to wrap your head around that very early. What are the 3 main roles that we foresee, and what are the criteria for people to qualify in these roles? So it becomes a no-brainer in order to give people access to that. In the same category, I would say, is write onboarding doc during, or documentation during, not after the migration. While you are actually migrating, you'll see that you'll do a lot of configuration in the platform. Very simple thing is time zones. What is my session configuration? What is the currency we're living in? When does my week start, on a Monday or a Sunday? All of these tiny options that you can build. Channel groupings, metric validation, all of these type of things. And while you're configuring, which is part of your migration process, it makes sense to document all of these things, right? Because all this documentation becomes part of a onboarding path. You'll go first, most likely. The person who leads the migration will be going into Amplitude the first, but behind you, a potential army of people and analysts might join that platform later on. Again, we've done this for organizations with 200 plus users. And in this case, all of the documentation that we had was proven very valuable because we could create an onboarding track that made people very comfortable very quickly with the configurations in Amplitude and explained a lot of the nuances that are there for the platform. Since you're configuring during migration, make sure that you also keep in the back of your head to document all of these tiny pieces because they will come in handy during the onboarding of other people. After go live, what do we do? So it's now May 31st. Tomorrow on June 1st, we go live. What do we do after June 1st? Is everything okay? Obviously not. We run a kind of, or we recommend to run a type of program. In our case, what we've done is we ran a bi-weekly forum. In the case of the customer I'm talking with, they branded it. It was called the Synergy Meetings. And every 2 weeks, there was a forum where people could put topics on the agenda and present their key analysis, key findings, some of the new features or quirky elements that they found in the platform to share with the other people and analysts. It basically builds a community around the new platform and the journey of onboarding together. Set up office hours and a community channel. Typically, this is for the champions that led the migration and are the new platform champions, in our case, Amplitude. What we've also done is we've made office hours available, meaning that we would be twice a week available for an hour or 30 minutes, and people could just drop in, into that meeting and start asking their questions. I'm stuck with a particular analysis. I don't really know how to do this. How do I get this metric in this report? Those type of questions. And at that point, we were able to provide one-to-one support next to the general biweekly forum and the synergy meeting. We're also able to run one-to-one sessions or office hours. But there was also very simply a community channel, be it in Slack, be it in Teams, be it in Google Chat. As long as people could find us, it was very easy for them to use us for Q&A after the go live in order to get everybody ramped up, everybody comfortable, and get confidence with the new platform. Last but not least, surface and consolidate bugs. If your migration is of a certain size, it's almost inevitable that some bugs will slip in, right? Either during release, either during configuration, all of these type of things. Make sure you keep a log of all the elements that you are aware of that needs fixing, right? It's not because somebody mentions a bug that 2 days later it's already fixed, and somebody else might still be struggling 1, 2, 3, half a day, hours or half a day in order to find a solution. It's way more comfortable or way more efficient to have a known bug log, let's say, where we publicly display in Confluence, in Notion, in whatever platform you're using, all of the current bugs that we're aware of and the ETA of when it will be fixed. It's a page that's usually used by the analysts. Whenever they encounter something odd, they could go to that page and figure out, well, actually, it's already known and it's going to be fixed by next week, Wednesday. Now, after go live, there's still this whole part, which is governance, and governance is a forever thing as far as I'm concerned. One of the key elements, I believe, is that whenever you have a specific piece of technology, somebody needs to own it, right? I'm not talking necessarily about the department. Ideally, it's a person. Ideally, it's not a one-person team, right? But ideally, it's a person who has the responsibility of the platform and is able to make a number of decisions. Why am I saying this? Because we've seen multiple times across all of the years that we're in analytics that if a platform is named without an owner, um, you end up with chaotic elements and the platform could decline very quickly, right? So if you have a new platform or if you have a platform in general and it doesn't have an owner, please assign an owner. Next to that, we have process ownership. For me, this is quite different from the platform owner itself. A platform owner would decide on what are the configurations, who owns and who has the responsibility for this platform, who's the one point of contact in case there are questions with regards to the platform. That person can distribute, of course. But process ownership is more like, hey, our groups are evolving. Our access groups are evolving because of X, Y, Z. How does this impact our process? Onboarding. Our onboarding platform is changing. How does that impact onboarding with regards to Amplitude, etc.? So it's not only about the platform itself as an entity, but there's also a bunch of processes around it, release management, etc. And all these processes also need an owner. Otherwise, what happens is after the migration, you've done all these processes once, and you have clearly defined them in the light of a migration. But if you don't follow up after the migration and nobody owns these processes afterwards, you quickly get into a no man's land where a lot of things can go wrong. Nobody's accountable. There's no responsibility, etc., etc., etc. So that's also very important to identify the processes and make sure that somebody owns them. And then last but not least, I actually introduced this one when I introduced the governance piece. Treat governance as an ongoing process, right? Whenever you own a process, whenever you own a platform, you're actually never done. There's always something to be done. I'm thinking of very practical elements. Think of governance in Amplitude when it comes to events. There's always going to be, or ideally not, but there could be every Monday built in your Monday check to verify if there are any unexpected properties, unexpected events, all of these type of things. But make sure, please, that governance is flagged as an ongoing process, that somebody is assigned. If that budget that is required is expressed in time, make sure that that person has time to take care of governance, because governance is the cornerstone, as far as I'm concerned, of a healthy long-term analytics platform. That was it from my end. If there are any questions, we'll take them at the end, and I'll now leave the floor to Catherine.
Thank you, Glenn. Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine. I have been with Amplitude now for about 5 years in our professional services team, working mainly with our large enterprise strategic customers to ensure that our customers are onboarded successfully onto the platform, but also driving adoption, making sure that the customers' orgs are healthy, but also eventually ensuring that the customers drive value out of using Amplitude and they're able to marry their business outcomes to actually the insights that they're getting from Amplitude. So my session is really going to go through a little bit more detailed into how we normally would work with a migration. And this would be a migration from our US data center to our EU data center. So typically this happens when we have customers who started off on our US data center and they want to then migrate their data over to our EU data center to ensure that they are GDPR compliant, and just to ensure that we have all the data in. So we really treat it as a dedicated org migration flow, as we have to provision a new EU org and then move the project's content and users into that new EU org. So these migrations are usually led by our own internal Amplitude professional services team, but we also work with our partners like Human37 to drive those migrations for all our customers as well. So the reason why we kind of also are involved in our migrations are we have to really align on we have to really have a cross-team coordination with our internal engineering teams. And therefore, we need early planning to make sure that our engineering team is available to run those migrations. And then it can also take, weeks to months, depending on the scope and engineering dependency. So it's key that we have those resources available when we start off the actual migration. So there's really a clear 4-phase plan when we're working with the migrations. So the first one is really aligning on the scope before the migration starts. And this is really important because we have to confirm the source org. We have to make sure that destination org is also available on the EUDC. We have to confirm which projects are in scope. So which ones are we going to migrate over into the new EU org, make sure we have a date range for the backfill. So to Glenn's point earlier, ensuring that we understand, what is the volume that we're going to migrate over for that historical data. And we also make sure that we check that the customer's contracted event volume is actually aligned to the time range, right? Before we actually kick off. So for EU migration specifically, we also ask about the data residency requirements, any live integrations, live experiments running, and whether the customer can really swap the API keys over safely from the US to the EU. And then phase 2 is really aligning on the migration. So we set up the destination EU org and operating model. We also ensure that we can recreate and copy the projects into the destination as part of the initialization phase. And then communication is also really important because then we have a dedicated Slack channel, make sure that the tracker is available early. Because as I said earlier, it's really a multi-team effort between both our internal professional services team, our engineering team, but also on the customer end, working with the devs on the customer end to make sure that we actually are able to get the data and understand what that data is required to migrate over. And then phase 3 is really the most important phase where we initialize the migration and start the live duplication. So this process is really key because we are actually starting to duplicate the live data from the old organ to the new org. So the migration start dates are typically about set 3 days in the future. So then we make sure that the duplication is scheduled effectively when we initialize it. And then this is also the phase where we can also start to backfill the historical data very, very carefully. Typically, it can take up to 2 to 6 weeks, but we've also seen that run longer depending on how much data we want to migrate over into the new EU org. For large org migrations, the internal process, we recommend a combination of the bulk backfills, but also separate short-range backfills near the migration start date to really avoid those gaps or duplicates of data. And then the last phase is validating the data in the EU org before touching the content, right? So usually what we recommend here is we'll have an internal team on the customer end to really make sure that the numbers, marry up between the US and the EU org, and we have no, and the duplication is, the historical backfill is also there. We review the event totals, looking at the unique users as well, and just to make sure that the data in the US org has transferred over to the EU org, successfully. So as kind of a summary on this, Amplitude will really own the migration setup and backfill, while the customer owns the scope. It looks at the readiness for the data, but also validates the data. So we work through all that together as a team with the customer. Next slide. So just to then go through a little bit on for you to understand, who's going to be responsible, accountable, going through kind of a RACI plan, and also consulted, but also informed. So if you look at the activities, as I've mentioned before, Amplitude is really responsible for creating the destination EU org, making sure that we run the historical backfill, making sure that we start the live data duplication by our internal engineering team. And then as a customer, customers are usually consulted at that point. So by consulted, I mean we have a migration plan that we diligently work through on a weekly basis to have those touch points with our customer to make sure that we keep them informed, what is happening with the data duplication into the EU org, how long is it going to take, like where are we percentage-wise in terms of getting the data over. So they're always kept informed of the process or through when that actual, live data duplication happens. And then it's really up to the customer to invite the strategic users to prepare any email, any kind of mapping that needs to be done, but also do that validation check as well, which is also very important to make sure that the actual migration is successful. And then next slide. And then there are other activities as well, like I went through before. So then Amplitude is really responsible for making sure that we migrate the taxonomy, settings, and permissions. But also on the customer end, it's really about working with the internal dev teams to update the API endpoints, code to the new EU API keys, reconnect any integrations that were in the US org into the EU org, and really making sure that the saved content is organized and checked before we cut over. And the cutover period is really determined by both Amplitude and the customer, just to make sure that after all those validation checks, we can then agree on a date that we're going to stop the actual migration, and then we do a hard switch over to the new org, and then the customer will not have access to the US org. And this is something that we do as a team, that we work through the migration process together. And then just a few kind of takeaways for you just to be aware of is from the customer end, it's important that we understand what the backfill scope is, right? So we need kind of decisions on that. We have the volume approved. That's really important because we don't want to go into using more event volume than is actually contracted with that customer. We make sure that the strategic users are identified for validation. The API endpoints owners are identified. So who in the customer end is going to do that piece of work. And then also really make sure that we have all our planning checks in place. So we have a migration plan that we'll work through together and really understand what integrations need to be reconnected, what is the cutover window, as I mentioned before, and also importantly, make sure that we shut the old org down. So when users are connecting to the new EU org, it doesn't redirect them to the US org that they might have actually connected to before. So these are really key points that we need to make sure that we have in place just to make sure that the migration is successful. So I'm going to hand over to Vincent to kind of go through some really exciting use cases.
You're right. So hello everybody. So I'm Vincent. I'm engineering lead. So why the hell is in engineering this discussion? So unfortunately, whenever there is a migration that needs to happen, there is some data involved, and whenever there is data involved, most often it's at scale, and when scale and data are in the same sentence, usually you need some engineers to deal with that. It does not mean necessarily that it's overcomplicated. It means that it means that there is a process that needs to be followed, and I'm here to guide you through that. To illustrate a bit that process, we took two examples. We took Kolsquare, which is an influencer platform, and we took Metricool, a social media analytics platform. They actually belong to the same group, which is called Team Blue. And the process that I want to show you is the same for the two companies and is the same for any migration. And it applies to smaller projects. That is the example of Kolsquare, or bigger project, which is the case of Metricool. They have to deal with about 500 million events. I would call that mid-size. For big migrations, we can be talking about dozens of billions of rows, but the process would still remain the same. And the reasons of the migration can differ as well, and the sources of the migration can differ as well. In the case of Kolsquare, they went from a full story and they migrated to Amplitude, while for Metricool, they actually migrated from one Metricool account to Amplitude account to another Amplitude account. We are here to discuss the success of a migration and how we can measure that success. I think there are multiple criteria that needs to be taken into account. The first one is obviously making sure that there is no data loss. So Glenn mentioned that already earlier. You don't necessarily want to have all your data migrated from the past. It has a cost, it has a legacy, and it could quickly be technical debt as of day one, right? So you want to make sure that you pick the data you want to migrate. However, of that data that you want to migrate, you want to make sure that you have 100% of that data. That being said, not only you need to migrate the data, you want also to make sure that there is a historical continuity, right? So if by migrating to Amplitude, you also want to import historical data, you want to make sure that that historical data does fit into the new picture. To make that happen, you need to transform the data because you may have other data schemas or naming conventions in the past. And lastly, time is important. We see some projects succeed in about 2 weeks. It does not need to be the standard. You obviously may have your own roadmap. It can take a bit more. But what is important here is that there are different stakeholders within your company that needs to be involved, and making sure that that timeline can happen in a controlled manner is actually quite important. And for that, you need to have visibility and a process. And I mentioned that the process for the two, so smaller or bigger, is the same. It is true, but there are actually not one process. There are two tracks that evolve in parallel. The first one that you want to kick off a bit earlier is making sure that every streaming information that you will get into Amplitude is already being streamed in Amplitude. It starts with the tracking plan. Glenn mentioned that already. It is maybe one of the most important milestones in your project is to make sure that you know what you want to have. It needs to be validated by business. It needs to be validated by the technical teams. And so there is a bit of work to be done there. And I will show you one example in a moment. And then on that first track, which is making sure that you basically build a new world, you also want to make sure that Amplitude is properly configured, that it does fit your data plan. And then lastly, you want also to make sure that you go live with that and that you onboard your dev team. In parallel of that track, you have a bunch of data that sits most likely in another solution or in another Amplitude account, and you want to import that. So the first step usually is to export your historical data. The way we do it usually is through BigQuery. The reason for this choice is that Amplitude supports natively and very well cloud providers. And so by avoiding sending API queries for historical data, we make sure as well that we can do that in an integrated manner or a native manner. And that makes the process much smoother. We then want to also make sure that once you have your tracking plan, that you also make sure that there is a mapping in between what you had before to what you want to have now, right? So what is important there is just not to hope it will work. It will not if you don't do that step. You really want to make sure that you have every edge case mapped to every new point in your new tracking plan, right? So historical data can be messy as well because you may already have in the past been through different migrations or different versions of your tracking plan, which means that the data, historical data may differ from 1 year to another year, and you want to make sure, or at least take the opportunity of that migration to make everything lined up. The third step on that historical data track is to validate. You should not import billions of events or millions of events directly into prod without having testing that in a dev environment. It's the same process as you would for live tracking, right? So you want to be thorough and you want to first validate in a dev environment. And then the last step is the go live and the import of the full data set. Without further ado, I want to quickly go through the first milestone, which is the tracking plan. The tracking plan is actually fairly simple. You have here one example. The shape of it or the format of it needs to fit as well your needs and your stakeholders. But the key elements are straightforward, right? So you need to have a list of all your events. You need to have a list of all the properties you want to track per event. And you want to make sure that you have also described the data types for each of those values. This is important, although Amplitude does support different types. Whenever you will do the migration and you will need to map the transformations, you want to know what you will transform your data types in, right? So if you have a string in your historical data, you want to make sure that if you can cast that as a number or if you cannot, and you need to keep that as a string. And those are rules that you need to take into account. And so here is a tracking plan quickly. So it's about 160 events on that one, and you see just describing what will happen, what do we want to track, what are the attributes, and then how do we cast these attributes. Very simple, very straightforward, but maybe one of the most important steps that you may have to go through. The second one is making sure that you have your historical data. It can be very straightforward or it can be painful. That would depend mostly on what you migrate from. If you migrate from Amplitude to Amplitude, for instance, the process is very, very straightforward because Amplitude does support native exports to cloud providers, in this case, BigQuery, which means that in a few clicks, you can export all your events into BigQuery, which you can use to rework a bit the data that you have. If you use or if you have another analytical platform or if you have raw data, you may need to go through their APIs to extract data in bulk, import it in BigQuery, and then the process is the same. So just to quickly show you how it looks like in Amplitude, in BigQuery. So basically, one native export of Amplitude data in BigQuery looks like this. So basically, you have all data points that you could imagine for the data that you have ingested in BigQuery. And then you can see, in this case, we have about 450 million rows. So you have the raw data in BigQuery. What do you do now? You don't do the transformations yet. You first map the transformations. And that's maybe the second most important step and maybe the most critical one with regard with data quality, because it's where you make sure that basically you handle all edge cases and that you define all the deduplication rules, that you define all the final casting or the transformations that need to apply, right? So basically what you need to map is all the source fields and how they will be transformed and how they will look like or be named into the new Amplitude setup, which means basically how it will be translated to your new tracking plan.
That piece of information is very, very important for the engineering team, because that's what they will use to basically build the transformation of the historical data that now sits in BigQuery to your new data that will also be exported to BigQuery and then re-imported to Amplitude. And that process, we often get the question, when you go live and when you have tested things. So first, once data is transformed, what we usually do is we use, again, the native connectors of Amplitude. It's super straightforward. It is smooth. In a few clicks, you can get your data from BigQuery to Amplitude. As I mentioned, you first want to go through a dev account, but one of the questions we get often is, do we first need to track live data and then migrate historical data, or do we need first to migrate historical data or track and then track live? In most cases, there may be exceptions, but in most cases, you may want to first track live data and then migrate your historical data. There are a few reasons for that. One of them being that whatever you define in your tracking plan, the developers may deviate slightly from that. There will be checks, etc. And there is no better place to see how data will look like that in Amplitude directly, because that's where the data is. And so that's why we often encourage to also directly live track as soon as possible in Amplitude once everything has been tested, so that if there is any deviations and that you validate these deviations, that the transformation process can be adapted to your live data. Because you could have a live data that then deviates from historical data, and if that's the case, then you are not building a full picture of your data. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason is also the timeframes and the windows. If you first migrate your historical data and then your live data, you will necessarily have a gap in between the two where there is basically no data coming in. That is something that is not non-fixable, because you can always re-import it later on, but it means that you need to do basically an historical backfill twice. So first the big bunch, and then for the period of the cutoff in between the live date that you can also re-import. And obviously you would like to, in most cases, avoid that process, and so you first want to track live data. To get to a point where you can call that project a success, there is no magic, right? So often the most important criteria that we see are first a close collaboration in between the different stakeholders. That means not only business and analytical persons. We will define the tracking plans, we will define the needs and what needs to be recorded, but also the engineering teams, right? Because and the devs, because that's they will implement things. They need to be fully aligned with how data will be tracked and what is the purpose of the data. So they make sure that the tracking plan is aligned with the data that you actually track. A second key important thing is to make sure that you tackle edge cases. There are a few edge cases that you can directly think of. One is data in the past has changed, meaning that potentially the value has changed, but also the name of the variables may have changed, right? Because potentially 3 years ago, you decided to revamp a bit your tracking, and then you changed the naming conventions. Things like that, which means that basically for one event that you will have in your tracking plan, in the historical data, you may have 2 or more events that correspond to that new event, right? And so you want to make sure that all these edge cases are mapped, and that for each historical event you have the new event. But that means as well that you want to make sure that you don't send one historical event to 2 new Amplitude events, right? So you want to make sure that you have data quality in, and that you don't want to duplicate data. And so every edge case needs to be spotted and needs to be QA'd and needs to be fixed and defined. And then the last point on that is also clearly identify or clearly define the identity resolution and how you will manage users and devices and all entities. In the case of Metricool, for instance, they decided to migrate to a new user ID. And so the way for that was to basically define merge roles that will happen, or transformation or mapping that will happen to all users, to map the old user ID that they had in the historical data to the new SSO ID that they had in the new Amplitude live. And so while doing the migration, it's important that you take that into account, because you don't want, even if it's the same user, but they would have two different user IDs, you want that to appear under one umbrella, of course. For the full process at Human37, we have a tool we call that Sherpa, and basically what Sherpa does is making sure that we can discover easily and in an exhaustive manner all your historical data. The complexity on that often is, and that would depend on the solution you come from, right? So if you come from a mixed panel, or if you come from full story or other solutions, the data complexity is different, but often they come with nested objects. And nested objects is the nightmare of data engineers or data scientists, because they are very hard to work with, because they can differ in between different rows, right? So in one instance, I could have one event with, let's say, brand ID being a string or being a number, etc., and it can differ technically. And so that creates issues, because you want to make sure that you have always the same values. And so Sherpa does handle that automatically and scans through all the variations that you have. We also deal with everything that is identity stitching, rate limiting, etc., to make sure that the data lands at 100% in Amplitude. And then Sherpa is designed to also migrate from different sources. I mentioned already a few, but often when you are new to Amplitude, you may come from different solutions. And just to name a few, full story, mixed panel, heap, segment and particle, Google Analytics, etc., are all solutions that can be exported as events, and that Sherpa handles. And then quickly going through Sherpa just to show you how it looks like and what are the different key steps. So first, what you want to see, and if not through Sherpa, right? So that's the same process for every migration, I would say. The first thing you want to do is to make sure that you see the different events and properties that you have, and that's what Sherpa does, as I mentioned. So we have here just an example of Google Store with purposely messy data that we created, where basically Sherpa goes straight, identify all, in this case, 10 million events, and go through all the properties and events. What you want to do second is to make sure that you have your tracking plan as a baseline. Basically here we import the tracking plan that I've shown you earlier, and we have a list of events and properties that you can edit in the platform, but you can as well decide to import from an external file that you have created. And then maybe the most important point here is the mapper. There are two things to map, right? So there are the events and there are the properties. The mapper is basically, you can also import from a Google Sheet or an Excel file if you want. But the mapper defines the transformation rules and defines what goes where. And so basically in this instance, you can see that in the source data, we have three variations of account created that comes into one account created event. Obviously here we raise a warning, because this may be dangerous, right? So basically we are saying, look, there are different events that are merged into one event. Is that expected? And then we raise a flag for that. But that's technically, that may be desired, and that is technically feasible, right? However, what is not okay is to have twice the same event that is mapped to, so if I have this, so twice the same event that is mapped to, let's say, two different events, that is not possible, right? So you don't want to have duplicated data, basically. And so we have warnings, and that helps us ensure data quality. And then the last point is on the properties. You want also to make sure that you map properties. Again, you can import it from a sheet, and basically there you can map all the properties to the defined one in Amplitude. It does map already every technical fields that are available in Amplitude. It's predefined, so it's just basically making sure that this lines up, and you can automatically generate that with AI as well. And that's where you can define as well SQL transformations for whenever you need to, for instance, cast something in a lowercase or uppercase, or maybe you want to run numbers or transform completely values, etc. And so that's how you would do it. And then the last mile is doing the export. As I mentioned, we are doing that with BigQuery. And so the natural step for us is just to generate the query that we will copy paste in BigQuery to make sure that you have it in BigQuery so that you can migrate directly in Amplitude in a very straightforward way. That's it from my side. I can do this and
Thanks so much.
give the floor for questions.
Thank you so much for all of this content, so much rich presentations and value from all three of you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone that joined us this morning. I think we can take a little bit of time just to answer some questions before we come up to the top of the hour. I see two questions. The first one I see is in the chat. So we've been putting off migration for months. What's the one thing that usually makes companies finally pull the trigger? Who wants to take that question?
I can give it a try. From my perspective, it's usually I come back into locking the why. The first thing I shared. Usually, when we see companies pull the trigger, is because they have made the decision or come to the realization that the pain they are having or the inability to come with insights or doing something with their data in their current platform is outweighing the perceived pain of doing a migration towards a platform that actually allows them to do it. I also think there's kind of like a misperception somehow or sometimes between how difficult in reality it is. It is a project, I agree. It is a project to migrate stuff, but I also think that today it has never been easier to do so. And also, I think very honestly that a lot of people unfortunately overestimate the value that some platforms have in the organization, right? A lot of people see analytics as using reports, using dashboards, but not necessarily activating or valuing, doing something valuable with their data. And if you're very much on the reporting front, I actually think that the pain of migration is actually very low because what we're looking into is reporting. And actually, if you think of the pain that you're having is the inability to make a decision and to do something with your data, and a new platform will actually allow you to do so, the pain of migrating and the cost of migration is actually very low.
That makes sense. Anyone else have any comments? I do have another question. How do you handle stakeholder pressure to migrate everything, including things like low value historical data?
Maybe I can help with this one. I suppose it's really just understanding what data is necessary, right? So what data is needed for the users to use the Amplitude efficiently, right? Are we going to migrate everything, and everything might not always be useful. So maybe it's determining in the beginning which data is being used the most, like which data has the most engagement in terms of the reports that are being created from that data. So really understanding the key dashboards, reports that are needed to drive the day-to-day business as usual, and then determine and prioritize, which of those reports are needed in Amplitude, for example. And then we can then migrate the data that is going to run those reports. And then you can then use it as a kind of a phase-by-phase basis and really do the most critical ones first, and then lean into doing the lesser critical as you go through the migration process.
Yeah, that makes sense. Showing the dashboards that have the most engagement, then doing a phase through.
Yeah.
I would also add the devil's advocate question of like, what would you not be able to do if the data would not be there? And in a lot of cases, there's no actual proper answer to that. Because again, we come back to reporting and dashboard and looking at data, kind of like because we want to know answer. But then the question is like, now that you know, actually, that's only the start of your journey. So if you don't do anything after that, you don't improve the product, or your product roadmap doesn't get updated, or marketing doesn't change their marketing spend for the next quarter, or our priorities when it comes to personas are not changing, then actually it doesn't really matter too much. I know it's a very annoying devil's advocate type of question, but usually it's one that makes people realize like, okay, I'm more attached to the data rather than what I'm going to do with it.
Mhm.
Fantastic. I don't have any more questions coming in, and we are close to the hour, so maybe we can stop here. Glenn, Vincent, Catherine, thank you so much for all of the content. Thank you to everyone that was on this session with us this morning. You will receive the recording within 24 hours. Happy to stay in touch if you have any more questions. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you so much to everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Have a great day.